My name is Vivek Narayandas, and I'm Shopify's Data Protection Officer, which means that it's my job to make sure that we comply and that you and your merchants are able to comply with privacy laws, including the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Quick disclaimer, I'm a lawyer for Shopify, but I'm not providing legal advice. GDPR is a 90-plus page set of requirements that will apply differently to everyone in this room. If you have specific questions around how it applies to you, you should speak with a lawyer. That said, let's dive into GDPR. What is the General Data Protection Regulation? As I said, it's 80-plus, 90-plus pages of requirements that come into effect on May 25th. The requirements fall into two general categories. The first gives individuals in Europe certain rights over, control over, and transparency into how their data is being processed. The second set of requirements is around how all of us, the companies that process data on their behalf, do so responsibly and show our work. So when a regulator comes a knockin', we're able to show them that we thought about privacy in advance and really took privacy seriously when we designed our products. We also at Shopify are big fans of GDPR. We think it gives individuals really important rights over their own data, and it allows all of us to help merchants start to rebuild the trust in how their data is being processed and stored by parties over the internet that has been eroding, particularly over the last few months. We also think that GDPR is the new global standard. We're seeing in a number of jurisdictions there are GDPR-like requirements that are being discussed, and it's inevitable that many jurisdictions in which we do business outside of Europe will also start to include the same types of requirements that GDPR imposes. So we want you all to walk away from this talk. It's 15 minutes. We can't go into too much detail, but we want you to walk away with three main takeaways, both around kind of what we have done on our end to address GDPR, but also what you guys will need to do on your end as developers to think about and anticipate GDPR. So the first takeaway, personal data is more than PII. So historically, privacy laws have focused on PII, personally identifiable information, things like phone numbers, email addresses, things that you and I and our merchants would intuitively think of as sensitive private information that needs to be protected. GDPR goes quite a bit broader, and it applies to personal data, which they define to include any type of persistent identifier that tracks a device over time. So IP addresses, cookie IDs, consistent hashed strings that are tracked over time. All of that stuff that we've traditionally thought of as anonymous is no longer anonymous. And that's really important and difficult for merchants who may not be as technically savvy as those of you in this room. What can we do to make this process, the process of merchants having to disclose what personal data is collected on their sites, as easy as possible? We've done a few things on our end. We've kind of updated our privacy policy generator to provide more clear disclosures around the personal data that we collect as Shopify through a particular storefront. But we know that doesn't do enough because, as the presentations yesterday showed, most of our merchants are using apps developed by those of you in this room. So we've also made some changes to our app store to help merchants understand what personal data is being collected by your apps. Specifically, we've created a section in the app store where you can link to a privacy notice where you can and should disclose what types of personal data you're collecting. We also recognize that many of you haven't really prepared a privacy notice before or may not have. So we created a template privacy notice that includes specific information that merchants will need to know from you around how you are collecting data, what data you're collecting, how you're using that data, and how long you're keeping that data. And other things like if you're participating in the Privacy Shield, for example, things that you may not necessarily think you need to disclose to a merchant, but that they'll probably want to know if they're thinking to ask the questions. So step one, put something up and link to it from our privacy policy section within the App Store to help merchants understand what they're installing when they install your app. Two, we're changing our app permissions interface so that when a merchant installs an app, every permission listed provides really granular information to the merchant around not just the types of information that the permission is providing access to, but very specifically, what elements of personal data is the merchant granting an app access to. So are they granting access to a customer's name, email address, shipping address, for example? Or is it just to their staff members' email addresses and names? We're trying to make it easy for a merchant to understand before they install an app exactly what types of personal data they're collecting and providing access to, because they'll need to then disclose that to their own shoppers. Second set of requirements is probably the most important part of GDPR and the part that gets the most attention: data subject rights. So GDPR creates a set of rights that everyone in Europe has with respect to their own data. It gives them the right to request access to that data, to request that that data be corrected if there are errors. It gives them the right to request that that data be deleted. It gives them the right to object to certain use cases of that data. And it gives them the right to request that that data be ported to a competitive service provider. We've done a lot on our end over the past year to make sure that we can respect these rights and provide our merchants some assurance that they don't have to worry about it on our end. Specifically, legal doesn't get to announce product features very often, so I'm very excited. But by May 25th, we are going to be building into a merchant's admin interface an ability to specifically request that an individual shopper record be deleted, or to request access to all of the information that Shopify holds about an individual shopper. But we recognize that that's not enough. We're not the only ones holding data about shoppers. And we're really trying to make it easy for the merchant to not have to go out to every app that they have installed. So by May 25th, we're also releasing a set of mandatory webhooks to all installed apps that will ping out when a merchant requests deletion, a specific payload that will instruct the installed apps what what shopper records need to be erased, so that the merchant doesn't need to then go to each of your apps individually and request deletion. Keep an eye out over the next week. We'll provide more details around what these webhooks look like and what the payloads look like. But the goal is really to make it easy for the merchants and to make it easy for you so you don't have to field manual requests from millions of merchants around requesting specific items be deleted. Thank you. On the partner side, it's important to note that data subject rights are not absolute, and merchants need flexibility to be able to anticipate how their data needs to be deleted and what kinds of data they need to provide access to. And some examples, a court order might say, hey, you can't actually delete this data. Or there might be a gag order placed on a merchant that says, hey, don't tell this user this particular piece of information. So it's a very contextual inquiry, and at the same time, merchants only have 30 days to respond to a request, which is not a lot of time if the merchant doesn't know where their data is being held and how it's being used. So as partners, merchants really need you to help them with a data map. They need to understand exactly what data you are collecting on their behalf or how you're setting up their site to have data collected. They need to know and understand where that data sits, how it's being used, and they need to start thinking in advance, what data can we not delete? What data will we have to respond to the shopper and say, hey, we understand your request, but legally we can't delete these pieces of information for audit, legal, regulatory reasons, whatever. So think about providing them with a data map or some sort of playbook to help them anticipate these requests, because again, they'll only have 30 days to respond. The last piece is around consent. This is another part of GDPR, really important. We also think it's the most misunderstood part of GDPR. So what GDPR does is it says, when you're obtaining consent, that consent needs to meet a new standard. It has to be informed and unambiguous, so the shopper needs to understand exactly what they're consenting to, and they need to explicitly opt in. So a link at the bottom of your footer to your privacy policy is no longer enough. It also needs to be unbundled. It needs to be independent. So you can't say, as a condition of providing you this good or service, you're consenting to me using your personal information in certain ways. That's no longer effective consent under GDPR, even though it might have been before that. So one of the most common questions we've gotten, and just stopping there for a moment, we've done a lot on our end to make sure that merchants can get effective consent for certain types of data usage. Specifically, we've made sure that for marketing, for example, merchants can set up their stores so that the opt-in checkbox for marketing emails is unchecked by default, so the user has to affirmatively check in, which again would be an affirmative explicit opt-in. And we've also tied some of our ancillary use cases, like abandoned cart notifications, to that opt-in, so merchants can configure their account to make sure that when they believe consent is required, they can tie certain types of activities to that consent. We've also gotten a lot of requests from merchants to add checkboxes into other parts of their sites, other parts of the checkout workflow, and particularly we've gotten a lot of requests to add a general checkbox to checkout asking for consent to process data for purposes of the transaction. And our response has been, and I would say to you guys, think very hard before adding in checkboxes. It sounds like the really privacy-friendly thing to do, but it actually creates confusion with shoppers, and it can create real legal issues for merchants downstream, and I'll explain what I mean there. So what GDPR does is it says consent is important. When it needs to be obtained, it needs to be obtained at a higher standard, but there are other reasons a company or a shopper or a merchant might need to process data. Some examples: to fulfill a contract, if there's a legal requirement to process data, if there's an emergency. There are reasons which might require processing data regardless of whether the individual has consented. But European regulators have also said consent is something special. When you ask for consent, if someone says, no, I don't consent to this use of my data, or I withdraw consent for this particular use, you can no longer rely on those other types of bases to justify your processing. So if there's an emergency and you've asked for consent and been denied, you can't process information. So let's double click on this, as Toby likes to say, and talk through a hypothetical. Let's say a merchant did add a checkbox to checkout, asking for consent to process a particular record. The shopper declines to give consent. The merchant now is contractually bound to fulfill an order, but can't use the merchant or the shopper's payment information, name, shipping address to fulfill the order. Obviously not a good result. Let's say the merchant kind of learns from this, changes their logic so that the shopper has to consent to fulfill the transaction. The transaction won't close until they consent. Now we're in the situation where the shopper may have to consent, but that consent, because it's bundled with the good or service that you're providing, is not effective under GDPR. This is not good for the merchant. They're in a situation where they have to make a trade-off of either allowing the use case where they may be denied consent and may not be able to fulfill a transaction, or they're getting consent, but it's not effective. So our caution to everyone in the room is checkboxes are good when they're used in the right times and in the right moments, and there's not always the right moment for a checkbox, and there are other reasons that you should think through when you're trying to think about whether consent is needed, and don't just add checkboxes willy-nilly all over your site. And that's part of the reason we haven't done anything in terms of the checkout workflow. Finally, just kind of repeating what I said earlier, GDPR is really an opportunity for all of us in the room to rebuild the trust that's been eroding in companies over the internet and how they process data. It's the opportunity to do something right, to make merchants' lives easier. This is a complicated set of requirements, and it's on us to make it easy for non-tech savvy merchants to understand exactly what information we're collecting on their behalf, how we're using it, and making it easy for them to give individuals and their shoppers the rights that GDPR affords over their buyers. I'll be around outside if you have specific questions, but thank you for your time, and good luck.